There is a tomb. It is carved into limestone at the edge of a garden in the shadow of a city wall. The entrance is low. You would have to stoop to enter, and across that entrance a stone has been rolled into place. Heavy, immovable, final. Inside there is nothing but darkness and stillness. A body wrapped in linen lies on a slab of cold rock. The air smells of myrrh and aloe, the burial spices that were hastily applied before sunset. Outside, the sounds of Jerusalem drift faintly through the stone, merchants closing their stalls, the murmur of pilgrims returning to their lodgings, a dog barking somewhere in the lower city, the distant clang of a Roman patrol changing shift. No one is looking at the tomb, because as far as anyone in this city knows, the story is over. A man was arrested 2 nights ago. He was tried before the religious council in the middle of the night, which was itself unusual. He was handed over to the Roman governor at dawn. He was beaten. A crown of thorns was pressed into his scalp. He was forced to carry a wooden beam through the streets, up a hill, to the place where Rome performed its most public executions. He was nailed to a cross. He hung there for hours. He said a few words, and then he died. His followers scattered like birds startled from a tree. His mother watched from a distance, held up by other women. A Roman centurion stood at the foot of the cross, arms folded, watching the sky darken in the middle of the afternoon. And by evening, a wealthy man from a nearby town collected the body, wrapped it, and placed it in his own unused tomb. The stone was rolled into place, and that should have been the end. In the ancient world, crucifixion was designed to be the end, not just of a life, but of a legacy. Rome did not merely execute its enemies, it erased them. The cross was a technology of annihilation. It destroyed the body in public, over hours or days, so that every passerby would see what happened to those who dared to challenge the empire. The names of the crucified were forgotten within weeks. Their movements died with them. Their ideas evaporated like morning mist on the hills of Judea. That was the system. It had worked for centuries. And yet, something happened in those 3 days. Something that the texts barely describe, something that the earliest witnesses struggled to articulate, something that 2,000 years later continues to resist a simple explanation. This is not a story about answers. This is a story about a question. What happened in the 3 days between the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth? The Bible records the events leading up to his death in extraordinary detail. The final meal, the garden, the arrest, the trial, the walk to Golgotha, the 7 sentences spoken from the cross, the exact moment when he cried out and breathed his last. But after the stone is rolled into place, the text falls nearly silent. There are no descriptions of what happened inside the tomb, no account of where his spirit went, no narrative of events during those 72 hours. The most detailed biography in ancient literature has, at its most critical juncture, a gap, a silence, 3 days of silence. And yet, the tradition that emerged from these events, a tradition that reshaped civilizations, inspired empires, and continues to claim the allegiance of billions of people, insists that those 3 days were not empty, that the silence was not absence, that something moved in the darkness. To understand what that means, we must go further back than the events of that week, further than the ministry, the miracles, the teachings. We must go back to the ancient texts that shaped the imagination of everyone involved, the stories they grew up hearing, the patterns they recognized, the expectations they carried. Because when these first followers tried to make sense of what happened, they did not start from scratch. They looked backward, and in the old stories they found a map. To feel the weight of those 3 days, you need to understand the world that surrounded them, not as a backdrop, but as a living reality, a city of stone and incense, a province on the edge of an empire, a people carrying a promise that seemed, with every passing generation, more and more impossible. Jerusalem in the 1st century was magnificent and oppressed in equal measure. The temple, rebuilt and expanded by Herod the Great, was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Its white limestone walls gleamed in the sun. Its courtyards could hold tens of thousands of worshippers at once. Gold plating on its facade caught the first rays of morning light and made the entire structure appear to burn. But the temple existed under Roman permission. Roman soldiers were stationed in the Antonia fortress, which overlooked the temple courts from the northwest corner. From their vantage point, they could see every gathering, every procession, every moment when the crowd surged with dangerous energy. Their presence was a constant reminder that the God worshipped in this temple had not yet delivered his people from foreign rule. The city itself was a labyrinth. Narrow streets wound between stone buildings. The smell of cooking fires mixed with animal dung, fresh bread, tanned leather, and the ever-present dust that rose from the unpaved roads. Water was scarce and precious, carried through aqueducts or drawn from cisterns carved beneath the houses. And during Passover, all of this intensified. The population of Jerusalem normally hovered around 40 to 50,000. But during the great festivals, and especially during Passover, the numbers swelled to several 100,000. Pilgrims poured in from Galilee, from the coastal plain, from the Jewish communities scattered across the Roman world. They came to remember, to sacrifice, to eat the lamb, to tell their children the story of liberation. We were slaves in Egypt, and God brought us out. The festival vibrated with this memory. It was not a polite historical commemoration. It was a living declaration of identity, a people defined by liberation, living under occupation. The tension was explosive, and everyone knew it. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, usually resided in Caesarea, a comfortable Roman city on the Mediterranean coast. But every Passover, he marched to Jerusalem with reinforcements, not to celebrate, but to control. His job was simple: keep the peace, prevent any messianic movement from gaining momentum, and if one did, crush it immediately and publicly. It was into this atmosphere, electric with expectation, dense with memory, bristling with Roman steel, that Jesus of Nazareth entered the city. The Gospels describe what happened next as a series of escalating confrontations. He entered the temple courts and overturned the tables of the money changers. He challenged the religious authorities in public debates that left them furious and humiliated. He spoke of a kingdom that was not of this world, using language that was both prophetic and dangerously political. The authorities decided he had to be stopped. The arrest came at night, in a garden outside the city walls. One of his own followers led the soldiers to him. The trial that followed was irregular by any legal standard. Witnesses contradicted each other. The verdict was decided before the hearing ended. And because the religious court did not have the authority to execute,
the prisoner was handed over to Pilate. What followed was swift and brutal. Scourging, a Roman punishment designed to bring the victim to the edge of death before the execution even began. A crown of thorns pressed into his head as a mockery of the kingship he was accused of claiming. The walk through the city, carrying the crossbeam, past crowds that had celebrated his arrival only days before.
And then Golgotha, the place of the skull, a rocky outcropping just outside the city walls, visible from the road, where crosses stood as permanent fixtures of Roman justice. He was nailed to the wood, the cross was raised, and for 6 hours he hung between earth and sky. The accounts describe phenomena that terrified those who witnessed them. Darkness fell over the land at midday. The earth trembled, rocks split open, and inside the temple, the great curtain that separated the outer court from the innermost holy place was torn from top to bottom. In the ancient world, these were not merely natural events, they were signs. Darkness meant that the cosmic order was mourning. An earthquake meant the foundations of creation were shaking. A torn curtain meant that the barrier between the divine realm and the human world had been breached. And at the center of all this, a Roman centurion, a man trained to be unmoved by suffering, a professional executioner, looked up at the cross and said words that would be repeated for millennia. Truly, this was the Son of God. The body was removed before sunset. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the religious council who had secretly sympathized with Jesus, obtained permission from Pilate to take the body. It was wrapped in clean linen. It was carried to a new tomb, one that had never been used, carved from solid rock in a garden nearby. The women who had followed Jesus watched where the body was placed. They noted the location. They planned to return after the Sabbath to complete the burial rites properly, with the full measure of spices and ointments that tradition required. The stone was rolled across the entrance. According to one account, the authorities placed a seal on the stone and stationed guards nearby. And the city moved on. The festival continued. The lamb was eaten. The prayers were said. The pilgrims prepared for their journeys home. And in the tomb, there was only silence. When the earliest followers of Jesus tried to understand what had happened, they did not think of it as a random tragedy. They went back to their scriptures. They searched the ancient texts, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, looking for anything that might help them make sense of the incomprehensible. And what they found was not a single prediction. It was a pattern, a recurring rhythm woven through their sacred literature like a thread through a tapestry, appearing in different stories, different centuries, different voices, but always carrying the same shape. 3 days. The most famous of these threads is the story of Jonah. God calls a prophet to go to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, the greatest enemy of Israel. Jonah refuses. He boards a ship heading in the opposite direction, as far from Nineveh as he can get. But a storm rises. The sailors, terrified, discover that Jonah is the cause. He tells them to throw him overboard. They do, and then the sea swallows him. A great fish, the text does not say whale, it says a great creature of the deep, takes him into its belly, and there he stays, 3 days and 3 nights, in the darkness, in the crushing pressure of the deep, in a place that is neither life nor death,
but something between. And then the creature releases him. Jonah walks onto dry land. He goes to Nineveh. He delivers the message he tried to escape. The story is strange and vivid and unforgettable. And it was precisely this story that Jesus invoked when he was asked for a sign. He did not perform a miracle on demand. He did not point to any of his previous wonders. He simply said, "As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." A short sentence, almost cryptic. But if you listen carefully, it contains an entire theology. It says that the descent is intentional, that the darkness is part of the plan, that what looks like defeat is actually the beginning of something. And Jonah is not the only thread. In the book of Genesis, Abraham takes his son Isaac on a 3-day journey to Mount Moriah. He has been told to sacrifice the boy. For 3 days he walks with this impossible command weighing on him. The loss is not yet real, but it is already present. And on the 3rd day, at the moment of decision, a ram appears in the thicket. Isaac is spared. Abraham receives his son back, and the later tradition says it was as if he received him back from the dead. 3 days of walking toward death, and on the 3rd day, life.
In the book of Hosea, one of the Hebrew prophets writes, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us, and he will heal us. He has wounded us, and he will bind our wounds. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, that we may live in his presence." This passage was written centuries before the events in Jerusalem. It was addressed to the nation of Israel, not to a single individual. But the early Christians read it and felt the hair rise on their arms. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up. The words seemed to reach across time and land precisely on the moment they were living through. The Psalms contained similar echoes. One psalm declares, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor let your Holy One see corruption." Another describes a righteous sufferer who is surrounded by enemies, pierced and mocked, yet ultimately delivered by God. These texts were not written as explicit prophecies of the crucifixion. They belonged to their own times, their own contexts, their own struggles. But when read through the lens of the empty tomb, they seem to pulse with a meaning that their original authors may not have fully grasped. The pattern of 3 days in Hebrew thought was not merely chronological, it carried symbolic weight. The 1st day was the event, the crisis, the loss, the rupture. The 2nd day was the silence, the void, the waiting, the absence of any visible response. The 3rd day was the turning point, the moment when the situation reversed, when what seemed permanent was shown to be temporary, when life reasserted itself against the grip of death. This pattern is embedded in the fabric of the Scriptures. Joseph was in the pit before he was raised to power. Daniel was in the den of lions before he emerged unharmed. The Israelites were 3 days in the wilderness before they found water. David hid 3 days from Saul before he was safe. These are different stories, told in different centuries, about different people. But they share a common architecture: descent, silence, emergence. And this is the architecture of the 3 days we are examining: Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Death, silence, something else. But knowing that a pattern exists does not tell you what fills it. Knowing that the ancients expected something to happen on the 3rd day does not explain what happened in the darkness between the 1st and the 3rd. To go there, we need to leave the world of texts and enter a world that the ancient imagination knew well, but that the modern mind has largely forgotten. The world beneath, the realm of the dead. In the modern world, we tend to think of death as an absence, a cessation. The lights go out and there is nothing. Whatever we believe happens after, heaven, oblivion, reincarnation, most of us think of death as a hard boundary. One side has life, the other side has whatever is not life. But the ancient Hebrews did not think this way. For them, the dead did not vanish. They went somewhere. That somewhere was called Sheol. It was not hell. It was not a place of fire and torment. That image came much later, drawn from other traditions and layered onto the original concept. Sheol was something different, something quieter, something, in many ways, more disturbing. Sheol was a place of shadows. The dead existed there, but in a diminished state. They were not fully conscious in the way the living are conscious. They did not praise God. They did not remember with clarity. They drifted in a kind of twilight, aware that they had once been alive, but no longer possessing the fullness of that life. The Psalms describe it in haunting terms. The dead do not praise the Lord, one psalm says. Those who go down to silence do not remember. Another speaks of a pit, a place of darkness, where even God's wonders are forgotten. This is not annihilation. The dead still exist, but they exist in a state that is barely existence at all. A gray half-life, a perpetual waiting room with no door out, and crucially, it was understood as permanent. The boundary between the living and the dead was a one-way passage. You could go in, you could not come out. The stories that hinted at exceptions, the witch of Endor summoning Samuel's shade, Elijah raising the widow's son, were told precisely because they were extraordinary. They violated the normal rules. They were cracks in a wall that was otherwise impenetrable. Now hold this image in your mind. A vast, quiet, shadowy realm, populated by every human being who has ever lived and died. Abraham is there. Moses is there. David is there. The prophets, the kings, the ordinary people, the forgotten millions, all waiting, all diminished, all trapped in a silence that has lasted since the beginning of human history. And into this space, something enters. The earliest Christian claim about the 3 days is not simply that Jesus died and waited in the tomb until Sunday morning. The claim is far more radical than that. The claim is that he descended, that his spirit left the body in the tomb and went downward, into Sheol, into the realm of the dead, into the place where no living person had ever gone and no dead person had ever returned from. This idea appears in one of the oldest Christian creeds, repeated to this day in churches around the world. He descended into hell. The word translated as hell is not the later concept of eternal punishment. It is the older, deeper concept, the place of the dead, the shadowy world beneath. And the claim is that he did not merely arrive there, he changed something. One of the most remarkable passages in the entire New Testament appears in the first letter of Peter. It says, almost in passing, that Christ went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. The language is compressed and unusual. The word for proclamation is not the standard word for teaching or preaching. It is closer to the idea of a herald making an announcement, a messenger declaring a new reality. Something has happened. The old rules no longer apply. The gates are open.
Who were these imprisoned spirits? The text connects them to the time of Noah, the generation that was swept away in the flood. But the tradition quickly expanded the scope. If Christ descended to the realm of the dead, then his presence there was not limited to one group. It reached backward through time, to Adam, to Eve, to every soul that had ever passed through the gates of Sheol and found them locked behind them. The earliest Christian art tells this story with stunning visual power. And here is something that many people do not know. The oldest depictions of the resurrection, the very earliest images that Christians created to represent the central event of their faith, do not show a figure rising from a tomb. They show a figure descending,
standing on broken gates, reaching down into darkness, grasping the hands of those below and pulling them upward. Adam on one side, Eve on the other. Behind them, a crowd of the ancient dead, rising from the shadows for the first time since the beginning of the world. This image is called the anastasis in the Eastern Christian tradition. In the West, it is known as the harrowing of hell, and in the Orthodox churches, it is still the primary image of Easter. Not the empty tomb, not the figure in the garden, but the descent, the breaking of the gates, the liberation of the dead. The theological implications of this idea are enormous. If the 3 days were not passive waiting but active descent, then death itself was invaded, not avoided, not overcome from a distance, but entered, experienced, and then from the inside broken open. Irenaeus, one of the most important thinkers of the early church, insisted that this descent was essential to the entire story. He argued that the one who came to redeem humanity had to enter every dimension of human experience, including the experience of death. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but fully, down to the very lowest place. Because if death was not entered, it was not defeated. If the depths were not reached, the redemption was incomplete. Origen, another towering figure of early Christian thought, pushed the idea further. He suggested that the descent was not merely a declaration of victory, but an offer of encounter. That the dead, those who had never known this truth in life, were given the opportunity to encounter it in death. That the gates of Sheol, once opened, were opened for all. This was controversial. It raised questions about judgment, about fairness, about whether the reach of grace extended further than anyone had dared to imagine. Not every thinker agreed. Augustine, writing in a later period when the church was more institutionally defined, was more cautious. He affirmed the descent as part of the creed, but did not speculate about its details. But the image persisted, because it spoke to something that mere argument could not reach. The idea that the darkest place is not beyond the reach of light, that the deepest silence can be entered and broken, that the oldest prison can have its doors taken off the hinges. It is worth noting that this idea did not emerge in a vacuum. The ancient world was filled with stories of descent. The Greeks told of Orpheus, who went into the underworld to bring back his beloved. They spoke of Odysseus, who traveled to the land of the dead to seek guidance. The Mesopotamians preserved the tale of Inanna, the goddess who descended through 7 gates into the realm below. These are different stories, different cultures, different meanings, but they share a common intuition, that the boundary between life and death is not as impermeable as it seems.
that there are moments, rare, terrible, sacred moments, when someone crosses that boundary, and that the crossing itself changes something fundamental about the relationship between the living and the dead. The Christian claim about the descent of Christ fits within this wider human pattern, but it also breaks it. Because in most of the ancient stories, the descent is partial. Orpheus fails. Odysseus can only observe. The heroes who enter the underworld return diminished, not victorious. Here the claim is different. Here the one who descends does not merely visit, he conquers. He takes the keys, as one text puts it. He breaks the gates. He liberates those who were held. And he returns, not diminished, but transformed. Whether you read this as literal event, as theological metaphor, or as mythological language reaching toward a truth that exceeds human categories, the image carries a power that has persisted for 2 millennia. The gates of death are no longer locked from the outside. They have been opened from within. And this brings us to the most overlooked moment in the entire story. Not the death, not the descent, not even the return, but the space between.
There is a day in this story that almost everyone overlooks. Not Friday with its weight of suffering and drama, not Sunday with its astonishing reversal, but the day between, Saturday, Holy Saturday as it is called in the Christian calendar, though in practice it is the least observed, least discussed, least understood day of the entire sequence. And yet it may be the most important, because this is the day when nothing happens. The tomb is sealed, the stone is immovable, the guards are in place, the body lies in darkness, and the world outside continues as if nothing extraordinary has occurred. The Sabbath has begun. By Jewish law, work is forbidden. Movement is restricted. The city is quiet. The festival of Passover continues. Families eating together, prayers being recited, songs being sung. But for one small group of people, huddled in a rented room somewhere in the city, there is no celebration. Only silence, only fear, only the crushing, suffocating weight of a story that has ended badly. We do not know exactly what the disciples did on that Saturday. The texts do not tell us. But we can imagine. We can reconstruct from everything we know about grief and shock what those hours must have felt like. They had left everything to follow this man. Their jobs, their families, their security. They had believed he was the one, the long-promised deliverer, the king who would restore their nation, the prophet who spoke with an authority that no one else possessed. And now he was dead. Not just dead, but executed. Publicly, humiliatingly, on a Roman cross, the instrument reserved for slaves and rebels and the lowest of the low. Everything he had promised seemed to have collapsed. Every sign they thought they had seen, the healings, the crowds, the moments of unmistakable power, all of it now looked like self-delusion. Some of them had run. Peter, the one who had sworn to die alongside him, had denied knowing him 3 times before dawn. The others had simply vanished into the crowd. And now, on Saturday, they sat with that failure. This is the hardest kind of grief. not the acute, screaming grief of the first moment, but the flat, gray, suffocating grief of the morning after, when the adrenaline is gone, when the tears have dried, when the world is still there and unchanged and indifferent to your loss. The silence of Saturday asks a question that has no easy answer. Can you hold on when there is no evidence that holding on makes sense? Can you wait when there is nothing to wait for? Can you sit in the darkness without knowing whether the light will ever come? Every person who has experienced profound loss knows this day. Not the crisis, not the resolution, but the terrible middle. The hours when the phone does not ring, the days when nothing changes, the weeks when the absence becomes a permanent feature of the landscape, and you begin to wonder if this is simply what life is now. The 3-day pattern says that Saturday is not wasted, that beneath the visible silence something is happening, that the absence is not as empty as it appears. But on Saturday, you have no proof of this. You have only the silence itself, and the choice of whether to endure it or surrender to it. This may be the deepest teaching of the 3 days, not the drama of Friday, not the miracle of Sunday, but the discipline of Saturday. The willingness to remain in the not knowing, to sit with the sealed stone and the motionless guards and the absent body and the hollow ache in the chest, and to wait. The 3rd day began before dawn. The sky was still dark. The air was cool and damp. The stars had not yet faded. Somewhere in the city, a rooster crowed, and for at least one person listening, that sound carried a meaning sharper than a blade. A small group of women gathered their supplies, jars of myrrh, bottles of anointing oil, strips of fresh linen. They moved quietly through the streets, staying close together, heading toward the garden where the tomb was located. They were not expecting anything extraordinary. They were performing a duty. The burial on Friday had been rushed. The Sabbath was approaching, and there had not been time to properly prepare the body. Now, in the first available hours after the Sabbath ended, they came to finish what they had started, to wash the body, to apply the full measure of burial spices, to give their teacher the dignity in death that Rome had tried to deny him. Their concern, as one gospel notes, was simple and practical. Who will roll away the stone for us? The stone was massive, a disk of rock set into a groove, requiring several strong men to move. The women had no plan for this problem. They simply walked toward it, carrying their grief and their spices, hoping that somehow they would find a way. This detail is worth pausing on, because it reveals something crucial about the state of mind of these earliest witnesses. They did not come to the tomb expecting a resurrection. They did not come with hope. They came with resignation, duty, and the last scraps of devotion that remained after everything else had been stripped away. And then they arrived. The stone was not in place. Every single account of this moment agrees on this one fact, even when other details diverge. The stone had been moved. The entrance was open. The tomb was accessible. What they found inside, or what found them, varies from one account to another. In Mark's account, which most scholars consider the earliest, a young man in white is sitting inside the tomb. He speaks to the women. "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." In Luke's account, two men in dazzling clothes appear. The women fall to the ground in fear, and the figures ask a question that has reverberated through 20 centuries. Why do you seek the living among the dead? In Matthew's account, an earthquake accompanies the rolling of the stone, and an angel descends. In John's account, the focus narrows to a single woman, Mary Magdalene, who runs to tell the disciples, who in turn rush to the tomb to see for themselves. The differences between these accounts have been debated endlessly. Skeptics point to them as contradictions. Believers point to them as the natural variation of independent testimony. But what matters most is not the differences. It is what they share. The tomb is empty. The body is gone. And someone, or something, communicates a message that overturns everything. He is not here. He has risen. The reactions are not what you might expect from a carefully constructed legend. There is no triumph, no celebration, no immediate certainty. There is fear, confusion, disbelief. The women tremble. They flee from the tomb. In one account, they say nothing to anyone because they are afraid. The disciples, when told, dismiss the report as idle talk. Peter runs to the tomb and looks inside, and goes home wondering. This is not the response of people executing a plan. This is the response of people whose reality has just been shattered. And then come the appearances. Not in public, not to crowds, not in the temple or the marketplace. In a garden, on a road, in a locked room, on the shore of a lake. Mary Magdalene stands weeping near the empty tomb. She sees a figure and assumes it is the gardener. She asks where the body has been taken. And then the figure speaks a single word, her name, and she recognizes him. Two travelers are walking to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They are discussing the events of the past few days, trying to make sense of them. A stranger joins them on the road. He walks with them, talks with them, explains the scriptures to them, but they do not recognize him. Only when they sit down to eat, and he takes bread and breaks it, do their eyes open, and then he vanishes. The disciples are gathered in a room with the doors locked, afraid of the authorities, and suddenly he is there, standing among them, showing them the wounds in his hands and side, saying, "Peace be with you." Thomas is not present that night. When the others tell him, he refuses to believe. "Unless I see the marks and put my finger in the wounds," he says, "I will not believe." A week later, the opportunity is given. A fisherman named Peter, who has gone back to his old life on the Sea of Galilee, sees a figure on the shore at dawn. He leaps into the water and swims to land. On the beach, there is a charcoal fire and fish cooking, and a conversation that mends what was broken on the night of the arrest. These scenes are intimate, personal, and deeply human. They do not carry the grandeur of empire or the drama of apocalypse. They are moments of recognition, reunion, and restoration, and each one reveals something important about how this event was experienced. It was not obvious. Mary did not look at the figure and immediately know. She had to hear her name. The Emmaus travelers did not recognize the stranger who walked beside them for hours. They had to see a familiar gesture, the breaking of bread, before the veil lifted. Thomas did not accept second-hand testimony. He needed to touch. This is not the pattern of a fabricated story. If you were inventing a resurrection narrative to convince the world, you would make the recognition instantaneous. You would make the evidence overwhelming. You would have the risen figure appear in the temple before thousands, unmistakable and undeniable. Instead, the accounts describe something far stranger, a presence that is real but not always recognizable, a body that can be touched but can also pass through locked doors, a person who eats fish on a beach but also appears and disappears without warning. Whatever this was, it did not fit any existing category. It was not a ghost. The texts are explicit about this. Ghosts do not eat, and the disciples are told to touch and see that this is not a spirit. It was not simply a resuscitated corpse, a body brought back to its former state, as in other biblical stories of raising the dead. Those people returned to ordinary life and eventually died again. This was something else, something for which no precedent existed, a body that had passed through death and come out the other side, transformed, but still bearing the marks of what it had endured. The wounds were still visible. This detail is perhaps the most theologically charged in all the resurrection accounts. The risen body is not unblemished. It is not pristine. It carries the evidence of what happened on the cross, the nail marks in the hands, the wound in the side. These are not erased by the resurrection. They are kept, they are shown. They become, paradoxically, the proof of identity, as if to say, the suffering was real, the death was real, and the one who stands before you now is the same person who went through all of it. Not a replacement, not a substitute, the same one, scarred but alive. And this is what changed everything. The people who experienced these encounters did not remain the same. The women who trembled became the first witnesses. The disciples who hid became public proclaimers. Peter, who denied knowing Jesus 3 times on the night of the arrest, became the one who stood in the center of Jerusalem and proclaimed the resurrection to the very authorities who had ordered the execution. Paul, who had hunted and imprisoned the early believers, became the movement's most prolific voice. Something transformed them, and the transformation was not gradual. It was not the slow development of a philosophy or the organic growth of a community of memory. It was sudden, dramatic, and dangerous. Within weeks of the crucifixion, these people were publicly declaring that the one Rome had executed was alive. They were doing so in the very city where it happened, in front of witnesses who could contradict them, at the risk of their own lives. Whatever you believe about the metaphysical nature of the resurrection, the historical reality of this transformation is among the best attested facts of the ancient world. A group of scattered, demoralized, frightened people became the nucleus of a movement that would outlast every empire it encountered. People do not do this for a story they invented. People do not endure imprisonment, torture, and execution for something they know to be false. Something happened on that third morning. The question is what? And the honest answer
is that the question remains open.
The empty tomb is a historical claim, and like any historical claim, it can be examined. The earliest written testimony comes from Paul in a letter dated to roughly the mid-50s of the 1st century, about 20 to 25 years after the events. Paul provides a list of witnesses: Peter, the 12, a group of more than 500 people at once, most of whom, Paul notes, are still alive and can be consulted. James, the brother of Jesus, all the apostles, and finally Paul himself. This list is remarkable for several reasons. It is early, close enough to the events that fabrication would be easily exposed. It is specific, naming individuals and groups. And it comes from a man who initially opposed the movement with violent intensity. Paul's conversion is itself one of the strongest pieces of indirect evidence. He was not a follower. He was not sympathetic. He was actively hunting down and imprisoning those who proclaimed the resurrection. And then something happened on a road outside Damascus that reversed the entire trajectory of his life. He does not describe the experience in detail. He says only that Christ appeared to him. But whatever that experience was, it was sufficient to transform a persecutor into an apostle. The empty tomb presents its own puzzle. If the body had remained in the tomb, the movement could have been stopped immediately. The authorities, both Jewish and Roman, had every motivation to produce the body and silence the claims. They did not. Not because they chose not to, but apparently because they could not. Alternative explanations have been offered. The disciples stole the body. The women went to the wrong tomb. Joseph of Arimathea moved the body to a different location. Jesus did not actually die, but recovered in the cool of the tomb. Each of these hypotheses has been examined, debated, and found wanting by the majority of historians who have studied the period. This does not mean the resurrection can be proven as a historical fact. It means that the alternative explanations face their own significant difficulties. Consider the stolen body hypothesis. It requires that a group of frightened, scattered men who had just watched their leader publicly executed by the most powerful military force on earth somehow organized a covert operation to overpower armed guards, move a sealed stone, remove a body without leaving evidence, hide it permanently, and then spend the rest of their lives proclaiming a resurrection they knew to be false. Many of them would go on to die for this proclamation. This is not the behavior of conspirators. Conspirators protect themselves. These people did the opposite. The wrong tomb theory has a simpler problem. Joseph of Arimathea knew where the tomb was. He owned it. The women who followed Jesus watched where the body was placed. And the authorities, if the claim of resurrection was based on a simple mistake of location, could have corrected it immediately by going to the right tomb and producing the body. They did not. And there is another piece of evidence that historians often note. The accounts consistently name women as the first witnesses. In the 1st century Jewish legal system, the testimony of women was not considered reliable in court. If you were fabricating a story to convince a skeptical audience, you would never choose women as your primary witnesses. You would choose men, respected men, religious leaders, military officers, people whose word carried weight. The fact that the accounts name women, and specifically Mary Magdalene, who had a complicated reputation, strongly suggests that the story was not shaped by what would be persuasive,
but by what actually happened. Archaeology, too, has contributed to our understanding. Excavations in and around Jerusalem have uncovered first-century tombs that match the descriptions in the Gospels. Rock-cut chambers with rolling stones, burial niches carved into limestone, and ossuaries used for secondary burial. The physical setting described in the texts is historically accurate. In 1968, archaeologists discovered the bones of a crucified man in a tomb near Jerusalem. A nail was still embedded in his heel bone. This was the first direct physical evidence of Roman crucifixion found in the archaeological record, and it confirmed details about the practice that the Gospels describe. The world in which these events took place was real. The stones were real. The nails were real. The tomb was real. What happened inside it remains the question. But historical analysis, however rigorous, reaches a boundary. It can establish that the tomb was empty. It can demonstrate that the earliest witnesses believed they encountered the risen Jesus. It can confirm that this belief transformed them and generated a movement of unprecedented scope and durability. What it cannot do is explain the mechanism.
It cannot tell you what happened inside the tomb at the molecular level. It cannot describe the physics of resurrection. It cannot provide a video recording of the moment. And this is where history hands the question to something else, to philosophy, to theology, to personal reflection. The resurrection accounts do not demand belief. They present testimony. They describe experience. They invite consideration. The women at the tomb are told to go and tell, not to go and prove. Thomas is invited to touch the wounds, not to write a scientific paper. The evidence is offered, but the conclusion is left to the listener. Every great story, when you reach its end, asks you to look back at the beginning and see it with new eyes. We began with a sealed tomb, a body in darkness, a city that had moved on. We followed the ancient patterns and discovered that the 3-day rhythm runs through the sacred texts like a heartbeat. We descended with the tradition into the realm of the dead. We sat in the unbearable silence of Saturday. We arrived at a morning that no one expected. And now the story asks us a question, not what happened, but what it means. Because the 3 days are not simply a historical puzzle to be solved. They are a mirror. They reflect back the deepest patterns of human experience, the moments when something we depended on is taken away, the periods when the world goes silent, the long stretches when we cannot see what comes next and have no evidence that anything comes at all. Every human life contains its own version of these 3 days. The Friday, the loss, the crisis, the moment when the thing you feared actually happens and you discover that fear was only a shadow of the reality. The Saturday, the silence, the void, the terrible empty space where nothing moves and nothing changes, and the only sound is the echo of your own questions. The Sunday, the crack in the stone, the first hint of light, the moment when the story you thought was over turns out to have another chapter. The hardest part is always the Saturday, always the middle, always the day when you have no evidence. The modern world is deeply uncomfortable with this. We want certainty. We want speed. We want the answer before the question is fully asked. We want Easter Sunday without the silence of Saturday. But the pattern requires all 3 days. There is a reason that the great spiritual traditions, not only Christianity but many others,
return again and again to this rhythm of loss, emptiness, and renewal. It mirrors something deep in the architecture of human experience, the seed that falls into the ground and dies before it bears fruit, the caterpillar that dissolves entirely inside its cocoon before emerging as something unrecognizable, the night that must reach its darkest point before the dawn can begin. These are not just metaphors. They are observations about the way transformation works. Real change, deep, structural, irreversible change, does not happen smoothly. It happens through disruption, through the collapse of what was, through a period of formlessness and confusion that feels, to the one living through it, like the end of everything. And then, when all hope of the old order returning has been abandoned, something new appears. Not always what was expected, not always what was wanted, but something. The 3 days of this story encode this truth in its most concentrated form. They say that the pattern is not accidental, that it is woven into the fabric of reality itself, that the God who made the world designed it so that death is not the final word. The tradition says that the Saturday is not empty, that something is happening in the depths, beyond the reach of sight or understanding, that the silence is not absence but gestation, that the waiting is not wasted but essential. This is not a provable claim. It is a trust. And trust, by its nature, exists in the space where proof has not yet arrived. The early Christians built their entire calendar around this pattern. Every week, on the first day, they gathered to remember the morning when the stone was found rolled away. Every year they walked through all 3 days in sequence: the Last Supper, the cross, the silence, the dawn, not as a memorial to the past, but as a present tense experience, because they believed the pattern was still active, that loss still leads to silence, that silence still conceals movement, that movement still breaks through into morning, not always in the way you expect, not always on the timeline you demand, not always with the evidence you require, but persistently, stubbornly, against every reasonable expectation. 2,000 years have passed since those 3 days. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have been born and died. Technologies have reshaped the world beyond recognition. And yet the story remains, not as an artifact, not as a relic, but as a living question. Because the 3 days do not belong only to the past. They belong to every person who has stood at the edge of loss and wondered whether anything comes next. To every parent who has watched a child suffer and felt powerless. To every person who has reached the end of a road and found nothing but silence. To every human being who has, at some point in their life, stared into the darkness and asked whether there is anything on the other side. The 3 days, in the end, are not an answer. They are an invitation to look at your own sealed tombs, to sit with your own Saturdays, and to hold open the possibility that the story is not over. We return now to where we started, the tomb, the stone, the silence. But perhaps we hear that silence differently now, not as emptiness, but as a threshold, a space between what was and what will be. The question that opened this journey remains: what happened in those 3 days? And after all we have explored, the patterns, the prophecies, the descent, the silence,
the testimony of those first frightened witnesses, the answer may not be a single sentence. It may be less like a fact to be memorized and more like a landscape to be walked through. Because the 3 days are not a riddle with a solution. They are an invitation to sit with the deepest questions of human existence. What lies beyond death? Whether silence can hold meaning, whether the worst ending can become a beginning. And perhaps that is why this story has outlived every empire that tried to suppress it. Not because it answers everything, but because it meets us in the one place where we most need to be met. In the darkness, in the waiting, in the space between the cross and the empty tomb, where the question is still alive and the morning is still coming. If that resonates with you, subscribe. It is the simplest way to make sure you do not miss what comes next. And there is much more coming. Lost books of the Bible, forgotten prophets, ancient mysteries that most people have never encountered. This channel exists to explore the ancient texts that still shape how billions of people think about life, death, meaning, and mystery. Not quickly, not superficially, but slowly, carefully, in the way these stories deserve. It is not just support, it is participation. Thank you for staying to the end. And now, one last question for you. What do you think happened in those 3 days? A historical event? A spiritual truth? A pattern that repeats in every human life? Leave your answer in the comments, because this question has been open for 2,000 years, and it is still worth talking about.